What do you do when your entire world collapses? What happens when the things you valued more than your own breath, the career built over years of relentless effort, or the relationships you trusted with the deepest parts of yourself, dissolve into nothing in a single devastating moment? Most human beings fall unmeaningly into despair, blaming fate, blaming others, and surrendering what remains of their spirit to the consuming darkness of bitterness and resentment. And we do not judge them for it. This is a natural reaction, a default reflex written deep into the architecture of human nature. But let us sit with this pain for a moment. Let us look honestly at the fragility of everything we build around ourselves. We construct our sense of peace on foundations that were never permanent. We assume the calm will last. We assume the ground beneath us is solid. And when the storm finally arrives, as it always does, we react as though the universe has singled us out for punishment, as though we alone were cursed, as though suffering were not the common inheritance of every human being who has ever drawn breath on this earth. The harsh reality is this: the universe never promised you absolute comfort. It never offered you a guarantee of continuous tranquility. No matter how carefully you lived, no matter how meticulously you planned, the external forces of this existence have always remained entirely beyond your command. A single shift in circumstance can dismantle what took a lifetime to build. To expect otherwise, to believe that your careful preparation exempts you from loss, is to live inside a dangerous and ultimately painful illusion. We are all profoundly vulnerable to the unexpected turns of this life, and the refusal to accept this truth is itself the primary source of our deepest suffering. Yet, for those willing to look beyond the immediate wreckage, for those who choose to explore the depths of authentic wisdom rather than drown in self-pity, this moment of total devastation is not a conclusion. It is a beginning. The collapse of everything external is the precise catalyst required to reveal what was always there beneath the surface: your inner freedom. This is not the moment to surrender. This is the ideal moment, perhaps the only moment, to establish true emotional discipline. Authentic wisdom does not ask you to become cold. It does not ask you to look upon your loss with hollow indifference. No. Feel the sorrow. Feel the full weight of what has been lost. Understand it completely. And then govern it. Govern it with a quiet, unshakable force of reason. This ruin you are standing in right now is your turning point. This is the precise space where you stop searching outward for validation. Stop waiting for circumstances to change before you allow yourself to be whole, and begin instead to discover the one foundation that nothing in this world can ever take from you: the unshakable foundation of your own character. What you are about to encounter are not simple observations about difficulty. These are the precise psychological patterns that emerge when a human being is standing inside the wreckage of their own life. They are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are the invisible mechanisms that quietly determine whether a person rises from devastation with greater depth or remains permanently trapped inside it. Look at them honestly, because the first act of genuine wisdom is the willingness to see yourself clearly. The first pattern is this: when loss arrives with its full force, anxiety does not come alone. It arrives as a wave that carries grief, confusion, and a desperate urgency to make the pain stop immediately. And in that state, the mind does something deeply human. It abandons reason. It pushes intelligence aside and follows the pool of raw emotion. The decisions made in this space, the words spoken, the actions taken, are almost never aligned with what the person actually values. They are reactions, reflexes of a nervous system overwhelmed by circumstance. And the tragedy is not the emotion itself. The tragedy is surrendering your judgment entirely to it and losing in the present moment what still remained yours to protect. The second pattern runs even deeper. It is the voice that rises quietly in the silence. It says, "It is over." It says, "I am finished." It says, "Nothing will ever be the same again." And the mind, untrained and unguarded, begins to believe it. This is the mechanism of self-pity, not the grief itself, which is honest and necessary, but the slow construction of a story in which you are permanently broken, in which the damage done to your circumstances has somehow become a permanent condition of your identity. The actual external loss, painful as it is, occupies a finite space in reality. But the architecture the mind builds around that loss, the catastrophizing, the endless replaying, the expansion of a single wound into a total verdict on your worth, that construction is what slowly extinguishes the light within a person. Not the storm itself, but the story we tell about the storm. The third pattern is perhaps the most deeply embedded of all, because it was built long before the collapse ever arrived. When a human being places the entirety of their sense of worth, their identity, their right to feel whole, onto external structures, a career, a title, a relationship, a possession, they have made a silent and dangerous agreement with the world. They have said, "As long as these things remain, I am someone." And the devastating consequence of that agreement is that when those things are taken, as they inevitably can be, the person does not simply lose a job or a relationship. They lose themselves. They lose their sense of existing as something of value. This is not an exaggeration. This is the lived experience of millions of human beings across every culture and every era of recorded history. And it is entirely preventable once you understand where true value actually resides. Now we turn to the wisdom that has endured, not as abstract philosophy, but as a living technology for human survival. Epictetus did not speak from comfort. He spoke from the direct experience of a man who had been enslaved, a man who understood at the most visceral level possible that the external world can take nearly everything from a human being. And from that place, he arrived at something that no amount of privilege could have taught him. He taught that within all of existence, there are precisely two categories of things: those within your control and those entirely beyond it. The collapsed career, the broken relationship, the judgment of others, the shifting tides of circumstance. These belong to the second category, completely, irrevocably. But the orientation of your inner life, the quality of your attention, the values you choose to act from, even now, even inside the wreckage, these belong entirely to you. No external force can reach them unless you willingly surrender them. Marcus Aurelius governed the largest empire the ancient world had known, and yet his private journals, never intended to be read by another living soul, reveal a man in constant dialogue with his own fragility. He wrote that the obstacle itself becomes the path, that the adversity standing in your way is not blocking your forward movement. It is your forward movement. And he was equally clear about something the modern world has deeply misunderstood about Stoic philosophy. The concept of apatheia does not mean the erasure of emotion. It does not mean manufacturing indifference to your own suffering. It means something far more demanding and far more human than that. It means feeling what you feel, fully and without denial, understanding what those feelings are telling you about yourself and about life, and then governing them, choosing your response from a place of reason rather than reflex. Feel it, understand it, govern it. This is the complete practice, not half of it, all of it. Seneca wrote something that may initially seem counterintuitive. He said that a person who has never encountered genuine hardship is to be pitied, not envied. Pitied, because that person has been denied the one experience that reveals the true depth of their own character. They have lived their entire life without ever knowing what they are actually made of. Every collapse you have survived, every moment you chose to remain steady when everything urged you to crumble, was not a punishment inflicted upon you by an indifferent universe. It was a precise and demanding education. An education in the only subject that ultimately matters: the nature and capacity of your own inner strength. The ruins you are standing in right now are not evidence of your failure. They are the raw material of something the undisturbed life can never produce. There is a specific kind of suffering that has nothing to do with what actually happened to you. It is the suffering that arrives after the event, after the collapse, after the loss. It is the suffering generated entirely by the refusal to accept what is already and irrevocably true. And it is within this particular kind of suffering that most human beings spend the majority of their pain, not in the wound itself, but in the endless argument with the wound. The ancient Stoics gave this recognition a name: amor fati, a love of fate, not a passive resignation to it, not a defeated surrender in which you simply stop caring about your own life, but a radical and deliberate act of acceptance, an act that says, "This happened. It cannot be unmade. Every ounce of energy I direct toward resisting what is already done is energy stolen from what I can still build." Understand what this truly means. The relationship that ended, the opportunity that collapsed, the version of your life you had carefully imagined and then watched disappear. These things are finished. They exist now only in memory and in the psychological weight you choose to carry forward. The Stoic does not pretend this is painless. The Stoic does not perform cheerfulness in the face of genuine loss. What the Stoic does is refuse to add unnecessary suffering on top of necessary grief. The grief is honest. The grief is human. But the prolonged war against an unchangeable past, that is a choice. And it is a choice that costs everything while purchasing nothing. Now consider the noise. When a life falls apart, it rarely falls apart quietly. There are watchers. There are people who observed your previous position, your previous confidence, your previous stability, and who now have opinions about your descent. Some will express those opinions directly. Some will express them through silence, through the subtle withdrawal of the respect they once offered, through the slight adjustment in how they look at you, now that the external markers of your worth have been removed. This is one of the most psychologically devastating secondary layers of collapse. Because human beings are social creatures. We are wired at a biological level to care deeply about how we are perceived by our community. The disapproval of others, even others we do not deeply respect, registers in the nervous system as a genuine threat. And so in the aftermath of external loss, we are simultaneously managing the internal grief and absorbing the external verdict of the people around us. The Stoic response to this is not aggression. It is not performance. It is not the construction of an indifferent exterior designed to signal that you do not care. The Stoic response is something far more precise. It is the clear understanding that another person's opinion of your worth is an event occurring entirely within their own mind. It is their perception, shaped by their own fears, their own insecurities, their own limited understanding of what a human life actually is. It has no power over the reality of who you are, unless you grant it that power. Marcus Aurelius faced the judgment of an entire empire. He wrote that it is not the person who holds you in contempt who harms you. It is your decision to believe that their contempt defines your value. The criticism exists in their world. It does not have to exist in yours. You do not need to build walls against it. You simply need to stop opening the door. And then there is the third boundary, the one that requires the most honest self-examination of all. When everything around you has been stripped away, the temptation is to remain frozen, to wait until the circumstances improve before you begin to act with intention, to tell yourself that meaningful action is only possible once the situation becomes manageable. This is one of the most seductive and most destructive forms of avoidance the human mind produces. Because the situation may not become manageable on your preferred timeline. And the habit of waiting for perfect conditions before engaging your own agency is a habit that compounds with devastating efficiency. Every day spent in paralysis is a day in which your capacity for deliberate action quietly atrophies. The Stoic practice here is ruthlessly specific. You do not ask yourself how to fix everything. You do not attempt to solve the entire architecture of your collapsed life in a single act of will. You ask only this: what is the smallest action available to me in this present moment that is genuinely within my reach and genuinely aligned with my values? Perhaps it is nothing more than choosing to sleep at a reasonable hour. Perhaps it is preparing a single honest meal for yourself. Perhaps it is sitting with your own thoughts for 10 minutes in deliberate silence rather than reaching for distraction. These are not small things dressed up as wisdom. These are the precise acts through which a human being begins to reclaim their own agency. Not through a dramatic single gesture of transformation, but through the quiet daily practice of choosing, even in the smallest possible way, to be the author of your own life rather than its victim. There is a moment, in the deepest part of any collapse, when the mind reaches a specific kind of crossroads. It is not a dramatic crossroads. It does not announce itself with clarity or ceremony. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary morning, or in the silence just before sleep. And it asks a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who am I, when everything I used to identify myself with is gone? This is not a philosophical question asked from comfort. This is the question that emerges from the wreckage. And the way a person answers it, or refuses to answer, determines everything that follows. The first tool that authentic wisdom places in your hands is deceptively simple. It is a practice so direct, so unglamorous, that the untrained mind will immediately dismiss it as insufficient for the scale of the pain being experienced. Take a single piece of paper. Draw a line down the center. On one side, write everything that is currently causing you suffering, that you have absolutely no power to alter. The actions of other people, the decisions already made, the losses already sustained, the version of the future that is no longer available. On the other side, write what remains within your reach. Not what you wish were within your reach. Not the grand reconstruction you are hoping to eventually achieve. What is genuinely and immediately available to you in this present hour? This is the control matrix, and its power is not theoretical. Its power lies in what it does to the nervous system when you actually practice it. Because the anxious mind does not distinguish between what it can change and what it cannot. It treats every source of suffering as equally urgent, equally demanding of immediate resolution, and so it exhausts itself, spinning endlessly against walls that were never going to move. The control matrix interrupts that spiral. It forces the intelligence to separate signal from noise. It redirects your finite energy away from the immovable and toward the territory where your agency is real. Now here is where the practice deepens. Grief is not the enemy. Let that land fully before moving forward. Grief is not the enemy. The Stoics never asked human beings to become emotionally hollow. They never suggested that the path to wisdom runs through the suppression of feeling. What they understood, with extraordinary precision, is that there is a critical difference between experiencing an emotion and being governed by it. You are allowed to grieve. You are allowed to feel the full weight of what has been lost. You are allowed to sit inside that feeling without immediately trying to resolve it or replace it with something more comfortable. But the grief does not get to make your decisions. The grief does not get to determine whether you sleep, whether you nourish your body, whether you maintain the basic disciplines that keep your inner life from complete disintegration. This is the precise line that emotional discipline asks you to hold. Not the suppression of feeling, but the refusal to allow feeling to become the sole governing authority of your existence. There is a version of you that can be completely devastated and still choose to act with integrity. There is a version of you that can carry genuine grief and still rise at a reasonable hour, still speak with honesty, still refuse to betray your own values simply because the circumstances have become difficult. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not reserved for exceptional people born with unusual strength. It is available to every human being who chooses, deliberately and repeatedly, to place their values above their comfort. The third practice asks something different of you entirely. It asks you to become a witness to your own life. When you are standing inside the collapse, the emotional intensity of the experience makes objectivity feel impossible. Everything is colored by the pain. Every memory becomes evidence of loss. Every uncertainty becomes confirmation of the worst possible outcome. The mind in this state is not perceiving reality. It is perceiving a story it has constructed about reality. And it is presenting that story with complete conviction. The Stoic practice of objective judgment asks you to introduce a specific distance between yourself and that story. Not to deny the facts of what happened. Not to manufacture false optimism over the genuine difficulty of your situation. But to look at the circumstances as data. To observe them with the same quality of attention you would bring to a situation happening to someone else. Someone you cared about deeply, but whose situation you could see clearly precisely because you were not inside it. Ask yourself, if someone I respected deeply were standing exactly where I am standing right now, what would I actually see? Would I see a person whose story was finished? Or would I see a person in the middle of a passage? A person whose current pain was real, but whose capacity to move through it was equally real? The answer you give to that question, when you ask it with genuine honesty, is almost never the verdict your overwhelmed emotions have been delivering, because the emotions speak in absolutes. The intelligence, when you give it the space to operate, speaks in possibilities. And it is in the territory of possibility, not in the false certainty of despair, that the next chapter of a human life is always written. You have looked at the psychology honestly. You have sat with the wisdom of those who carried far heavier burdens than most of us will ever know. You have examined the tools. You have begun to understand the precise difference between what belongs to you and what was never yours to carry. Now something else needs to be said. Something that the noise of the modern world makes extraordinarily difficult to hear. Transformation is not an event. It is not a single moment of insight after which everything changes. It is not a dramatic realization that arrives one morning and permanently reorganizes a human life. The mind wants it to be that. The mind is drawn to the idea of a single turning point, a clean before and after, a precise moment of rupture that divides the old self from the new. But that is not how genuine transformation works. And believing that it is one of the most quietly destructive illusions a person in recovery from collapse can hold. Genuine transformation is built in the small hours, in the moments no one observes, in the choices made when the emotional weight is heaviest and the motivation is lowest. It is built in the decision to govern your response when every instinct in your body is urging you toward reaction. It is built in the choice to maintain your integrity when the situation would entirely excuse you for abandoning it. This is what the Stoics understood about character that the modern world has largely forgotten. Character is not revealed in the moments of ease. Character is not demonstrated when circumstances are favorable and the path ahead is clear. Character is what remains and what operates when everything else has been stripped away, when the titles are gone, when the external validation has dried up, when the structure they used to tell you who you were no longer exists. What remains then is not nothing. What remains then is everything that actually matters. Marcus Aurelius returned to this truth repeatedly throughout his private writing. Not because he had mastered it, but precisely because he had not. Because he understood that the work of governing oneself is never completed. It is a daily practice, a daily recommitment to the values you have chosen, regardless of whether the day makes that recommitment easy or nearly impossible. He wrote to himself, not to posterity, not to an audience, but to himself alone, as a man who needed to be reminded of what he already knew, that the quality of a human life is determined not by what happens to it, but by the quality of attention and intention brought to each moment within it. Consider what this means for where you are standing right now. The collapse you have experienced, or are currently experiencing, has removed something from your life. Perhaps many things. But look carefully at what it has not removed. It has not removed your capacity for honest thought. It has not removed your ability to choose how you direct your attention in this present moment. It has not removed your access to the values that defined who you were before the world rearranged itself around you. It has not removed the fundamental human freedom that Epictetus identified from inside the experience of slavery itself. The freedom to determine the orientation of your own inner life. These things were not stored in the career that ended. They were not housed in the relationship that dissolved. They were not dependent on the external structure that collapsed. They were always located somewhere that circumstance cannot reach. And they are there now, waiting, not for the situation to improve, not for the pain to subside, not for some future moment when conditions finally become favorable for your return to wholeness. They are available now, in this moment. in this specific and unrepeatable present. The person who emerges from devastation without having done this inner work emerges diminished. They carry the wound forward without understanding it. They rebuild the external structure without examining what caused the first one to collapse. And so they remain vulnerable in precisely the same way to precisely the same kind of loss. But the person who uses the collapse as the Stoics intended it to be used, as a precise and demanding teacher, that person does not simply recover. They do not simply return to the level they occupied before the fall. They emerge with something that cannot be manufactured in comfortable circumstances. A quality of inner steadiness, a depth of self-knowledge, a relationship with their own character that was simply not available to them before the ground gave way. Seneca wrote that difficulties reveal what was already there. They do not create weakness, they expose it. And in doing so, they offer the one thing that ease never can, the precise knowledge of what still needs to be built. This is not a consolation prize. This is not a reframing designed to make loss feel more palatable. This is the actual architecture of how human beings develop genuine resilience. Not by avoiding the hard passages, not by escaping the storms, but by remaining fully present within them, with enough self-awareness to learn what they are there to teach. The transformation you are capable of is not waiting on the other side of this difficulty. It is happening inside it, right now, in the choices you make today, in the quality of attention you bring to this present hour, in the decision, made quietly and without an audience, to govern yourself with wisdom, even when wisdom is the hardest thing available to you. There is something the collapsed life reveals, that the comfortable life spends years carefully concealing. It reveals the difference between what you believed about yourself and what is actually true. Most human beings construct an identity over the course of their lives that is quietly dependent on external confirmation, not because they are weak, not because they lack intelligence or sincerity, but because the world they grew up inside rewarded certain performances, certain achievements, certain visible markers of progress and worth. And so, without fully realizing it, they began to locate themselves in those markers. They began to answer the question of who they are by pointing outward. And then the markers disappear, and the pointing outward finds nothing there. This is not a personal failing. This is one of the most universal experiences in the entire history of human psychology. The Stoics wrote about it with extraordinary precision, not because they were immune to it, but because they understood it from the inside. They had felt the pull of external validation. They had experienced the seductive comfort of allowing the world's approval to function as a substitute for genuine self-knowledge. And they had learned, at significant personal cost, exactly what that substitution eventually produces. So let us be precise about what is actually being asked of you here. Not performance, not the construction of a new external identity to replace the one that collapsed. Not the urgent rebuilding of visible markers so that the people around you can once again locate you within a familiar category of worth. What is being asked is something far more demanding than that, and far more liberating. It is the work of understanding, at a level that goes beyond intellectual agreement, that your value as a human being is not a variable. It does not fluctuate with your circumstances. It does not rise when you are successful and fall when you are not. It is not determined by the opinion of people who only knew you through the lens of your external position. Epictetus was unambiguous about this. He taught that the person who has genuinely internalized this understanding cannot be humiliated, not because they are arrogant, not because they have stopped caring about others, but because they no longer require the external world to confirm what they already know about themselves. The approval becomes pleasant when it arrives, but its absence no longer constitutes a verdict. Now look honestly at the grief you are carrying. Beneath the loss of the external thing, beneath the practical disruption and the genuine difficulty of the changed circumstances, there is often a second layer of pain that receives far less acknowledgement. It is the pain of feeling unseen, the pain of having constructed a version of yourself for the world and then watching that version become irrelevant. The pain of suspecting, in the quiet moments, that perhaps the external thing was not just something you had. Perhaps it was something you were. This is the pain that requires the most careful attention, because it cannot be resolved by rebuilding the external structure. It can only be resolved by doing what the Stoics call the essential work, the work of returning to what they named virtue. Not virtue in the narrow moral sense that the word has been reduced to in modern usage. Virtue in its original and complete meaning, the full expression of your highest human capacities, your capacity for honest thought, for courageous action aligned with your genuine values, for justice in how you treat yourself and others, for the wisdom to distinguish between what genuinely matters and what only appeared to matter because the world told you it did. This is the foundation that cannot be taken, not because the world will not try, but because it does not reside in any place the world has access to. Marcus Aurelius returned again and again in his writing to a single question: not what has happened to me, but who am I choosing to be in response to what has happened to me? This is the shift that changes everything. Not as a concept, not as an inspiring idea to be held lightly and then set aside when the difficulty intensifies, but as a living practice, applied in the specific and unglamorous details of an actual day. When you feel the pull toward bitterness, and you choose honesty instead, that is the foundation being built. When you feel the exhaustion of sustained difficulty, and you choose to maintain one small discipline anyway, that is the foundation being built. When you feel the temptation to define yourself entirely by what you have lost, and you choose instead to ask what you still carry, what still remains genuinely yours regardless of circumstance, that is the foundation being built. This is not abstract philosophy. This is the actual daily texture of what the Stoics called self-mastery. And it is available to you not in some future state of recovered stability. It is available to you here, in the difficulty, in the uncertainty, in the exact conditions that feel least hospitable to growth. Because those conditions, as Seneca understood with complete clarity, are not obstacles to the development of genuine inner strength. They are its only reliable source. You have traveled a considerable distance in this exploration. Not a comfortable distance. Not the kind of distance that feels like progress because it has been easy, but the kind that feels like progress precisely because it has asked something real of you, because it has required you to look at things most people spend enormous energy avoiding. And now we arrive at the question that underlies everything that has been said. Not what happened to you, not even how you respond to what happened to you, but something deeper than both of those. What kind of person do you intend to become on the other side of this? This is not a motivational question. It is not being asked to generate enthusiasm or to manufacture a feeling of hope where none currently exists. It is being asked because the answer to it, made privately and honestly, is the single most powerful active agency available to a human being in the aftermath of collapse. The Stoics were not idealists. They did not pretend that the answer to this question was easy to arrive at, or easy to live up to once arrived at. They were extraordinarily clear-eyed about the nature of human weakness, about the consistency with which human beings choose comfort over growth, reaction over reflection, the familiar over the genuinely better. And yet they also understood something about human nature that the purely cynical view misses entirely. That within every human being, beneath the accumulated layers of fear and habit and the various performances constructed to navigate social existence, there is a capacity for something remarkable. A capacity that does not require exceptional talent or unusual circumstance to activate. It requires only the decision to exercise it. The decision to govern yourself. Not perfectly, not without failure, not in some idealized continuous state of stoic composure that bears no resemblance to the actual texture of a human life, but genuinely, repeatedly, with the honest acknowledgement of every failure and the equally honest recommitment that follows it. Epictetus described the practice of philosophy not as the accumulation of impressive ideas, but as the daily work of bringing your actual behavior into alignment with what you claim to value, not occasionally, not when it is convenient, not when the circumstances make it easy, but as a consistent and unglamorous daily practice. The gap between what we profess to believe and how we actually live, that gap is where most human suffering quietly breeds. And the closing of that gap, even partially, even imperfectly, is what the Stoics meant when they spoke of a life well lived. Now let us speak directly about what this means in the specific context of a life that has been broken open. The scripts that the mind runs in the aftermath of collapse are powerful. They are well practiced. They have been running so long that they feel less like thoughts and more like facts. The script that says the damage is permanent. The script that says the people who walked away were right to do so. The script that says the version of life you had before was the only version worth having. The script that says you are defined by what you have lost rather than by how you choose to carry it. These scripts are not the truth. They are the output of a mind under sustained pressure, defaulting to its most familiar and most limiting patterns. And they can be interrupted. Not by force, not by suppressing them or pretending they are not running, but by introducing a different voice into the conversation. The voice that says, this event occurred. It is real. Its consequences are real. And my response to it, from this moment forward, is also real. And it belongs entirely to me. That voice is not external. It does not arrive from a teacher or a text or a moment of sudden inspiration. It is cultivated, slowly, through the repeated practice of choosing it, even when the other scripts are louder, even when the other scripts feel more honest, even when exhaustion makes the practiced patterns feel like the only available option. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journals that has endured for nearly 2,000 years, not because it is poetic, but because it is precisely true. He wrote that you have the power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength, not comfort, not the absence of difficulty, not the guarantee that the external world will eventually arrange itself in your favor. Strength, the specific and durable kind that does not depend on circumstances remaining favorable. The kind that is available in exactly the conditions you are currently navigating. And this strength, once genuinely developed, does not diminish when the next difficulty arrives. It compounds. Each passage through genuine adversity, navigated with honest self-examination and deliberate choice, adds a layer of inner steadiness that the comfortable life simply cannot produce. You are not the same person who entered this collapse. That person is already behind you. What stands here now, in the middle of the difficulty, is someone in the process of discovering something that cannot be taught in ease. The question is not whether you will emerge from this. The question is what you will have built in the passing through. And that has always been entirely up to you. Everything that has been explored here, every insight examined, every layer of psychology uncovered, every piece of ancient wisdom brought into contact with the specific weight of a modern collapse, has been pointing toward a single understanding. Not a conclusion that wraps everything neatly. Not a final answer that dissolves the difficulty, but something more honest than either of those. A recognition that the storm you are standing inside, or have stood inside, or will one day stand inside, is not evidence that something has gone fundamentally wrong with your life. It is evidence that you are fully alive, that you have loved something enough to grieve its loss, that you have built something real enough to feel the weight of its collapse, that you are human in the complete and undiminished sense of that word. The Stoics did not promise freedom from pain. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about everything they wrote and everything they lived. They did not offer a philosophy of escape. They offered something far more demanding and far more sustaining than escape. They offered a philosophy of presence. The capacity to remain fully present inside the difficulty, to feel it without being consumed by it, to understand it without being defined by it, to govern your response to it, not from a place of suppression or performance, but from the deep and practiced alignment between your values and your actions. Feel it, understand it, govern it. These three words are not a sequence to be completed and then set aside. They are a practice to be returned to, again and again, in the small moments and the large ones, in the quiet mornings and the unbearable nights, in the interactions that test your patience and the solitary hours that test your honesty. Because wisdom is not a destination, it is a direction. And the person who chooses that direction, even imperfectly, even with frequent failure and honest recommitment, is already living something that most people will spend their entire lives searching for from the outside. A life that belongs to them. Not a life free of loss. Not a life protected from the inevitable turning of circumstances. Not a life in which the external world has finally arranged itself into a form that permits peace. But a life in which the peace does not originate from the external world at all. A life in which the tranquility, however hard-won, however imperfect, however frequently interrupted and repeatedly rebuilt, comes from the inside. This is what Epictetus carried out of slavery. This is what Marcus Aurelius returned to every morning before facing the demands of an empire. This is what Seneca pointed toward in his letters written at the edge of his own mortality. Not the absence of storms, but the unshakable knowledge of where to stand when the storms arrive. You already know where that place is. You have always known. The work is simply the daily practice of returning to it, especially on the days when returning feels impossible. Especially on the days when the distance between where you are and where you know you are capable of being feels unbridgeable. Those are precisely the days that matter most. The storms of life will arrive again. That is not pessimism. That is the honest acknowledgement of what it means to be alive in a world that does not operate according to our preferences. But you are no longer the same person who met the last storm unprepared. Something has shifted. Something has been examined and understood and, however partially, integrated. And the next time the ground moves beneath you, you will not be starting from nothing. You will be starting from here. From everything this passage has cost you and everything it has quietly built in you. From the self-knowledge that only difficulty can produce. From the inner steadiness that only the choice to govern yourself, repeatedly and imperfectly and honestly, can develop over time. The tranquility you are seeking is not somewhere ahead of you. It is something you are constructing, right now, in this moment. With every choice you make to meet your own life with wisdom rather than with fear. That is the only work that has ever truly mattered, and it is yours to do. There is one final thing to be said. Not as instruction, not as another layer of wisdom to be absorbed and catalogued, but as something simpler than either of those. As an acknowledgement of what it actually costs to live the way we have been exploring together. Because it does cost something. The path of genuine self-mastery, of emotional discipline, of choosing wisdom over comfort in the specific and unglamorous moments of an actual human life, is not an easy path. Anyone who presents it as easy has not truly walked it. There will be days when everything explored here feels distant and theoretical. Days when the grief is louder than the wisdom. When the old scripts run with more force than the new understanding. When the practice of returning to your own values feels less like freedom and more like an exhausting obligation. Those days are not failures. They are part of the practice. Epictetus did not ask for perfection. Marcus Aurelius did not achieve it. Seneca wrote honestly about his own distance from the ideals he articulated so beautifully. What united them was not the absence of struggle. It was the refusal to allow struggle to become the final word. The recommitment after the failure. The return after the drift. The quiet decision made in the privacy of your own conscience to try again, not because it is easy, not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative, the slow surrender of your inner life to circumstances you did not choose, is a cost you are no longer willing to pay. That decision, made honestly, made repeatedly, made without an audience and without the promise of immediate reward. That is the whole of it. Not the grand transformation, not the dramatic emergence from the ruins into a permanently elevated state of being, but the daily, ordinary, unglamorous practice of choosing to govern yourself with the best of what you understand. The storms will keep coming, and you will keep meeting them. Not as someone waiting for the weather to change, but as someone who has learned, through real cost and genuine reflection, that the weather was never what determined the quality of a human life. You already carry what you need. You have always carried it. The only question that remains is whether you will choose to use it. Stay strong, stay wise, and keep living your truth.